Software restriction using group policy. With Windows 2003 group policy, software restrictions enable you to have a say in which applications are allowed to run in your environment. Now, whether this be games that you don't want users wasting company time playing, older versions of software, or malicious code or scripts from really spoiling your day, we can use software restriction policies to prevent applications from running. Now, there are 4 types of software restriction policies available in Windows 2003. The first type is a hash rule. A hash rule runs a quick algorithm over the file to create a hash value to uniquely identify the file. Hash rules will still apply even if the file is renamed or moved to a different location, such as a different folder. However, if the file changes, for example if the file was a script and it was edited, or an executable was modified by a hex editor, then the hash would have to be reapplied for it to remain effective. We can also use certificate rules to ensure that pre-approved applications are signed to enable us to ensure that the files are authentic and not some virus or malicious code. Next, we have path rules, where we can specify the location of files that are allowed or not allowed to run. With path rules, if a file is moved from the location specified in the rule, then the rule becomes ineffective. And path rules can also apply to registry keys. And finally, we have Internet Zone rules that apply to Windows installer packages and identify software that comes from Internet Explorer zones. Okay, so let's go and create some rules. So we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then go to Active Directory Users and Computers. Now we'll come over here to our US Users OU, and we'll right click and we'll select Properties, and we'll come up here to the Group Policy tab. Now we'll click on New, which creates a new group policy object, and we'll just give this one a name. We'll call this one SW Rules, for example, and then we'll click on Edit. Now we're making rules here that apply to our users, so under our user configuration, we'll expand Windows Settings, Security Settings, and here we can see our software restriction policies. Now currently, as you can see, we don't have any software restriction policies defined, so what we'll do is we'll come back here and we'll right click and then we'll select New Software Restriction Policies. Now, as you can see in the right hand window here, we have 5 options. We'll go into security levels by double clicking, and we have 2 sub options here, disallowed and unrestricted. Now the default setting here is unrestricted, which is evidenced by the black tick that we can see over the icon. Now these settings here are your global settings, which indicate whether software is disallowed from running or unrestricted. So if you wanted to disallow all software from running, which would obviously make your systems more secure, but it'll kind of lock your users out from doing anything at all, you'd simply right click on disallowed and then would choose to set this as default. Now if we did choose to set this as default, users won't be able to run any applications regardless of their access rights unless we explicitly create some rules to allow it. So we'll leave the default as unrestricted, and then we'll click back here on software restriction policies. Now we'll go and take a look at some of the types of rules we can create. So we'll double click on additional rules, and we can see that we already have 4 rules in here which just define a few different registry keys. Now on the right here we can see that the setting is unrestricted, meaning that people can run applications from these locations. So for example, if I double click on one of our rules here and then change the default security level from unrestricted to disallowed, the end result would be our user would no longer be able to run any executable files in our Windows directory. Okay, so we'll press cancel here. Alright, now to create a new rule, we'll just right click, and then from here we can select either a certificate rule, a hash rule, internet zone rule, or a path rule. Now we'll go and select a hash rule, which opens up a new rule dialog box. So the first thing we need to do is tell it which file that we want this rule to control. So to locate the file, we'll simply click on Browse, and then we'll navigate to the path where we have a copy of the file. Okay, so let's assume that we don't want our users to be able to run Windows Calculator. Now we're on a Windows 2003 server here, so if we browse to our Windows System 32 directory, and then I'll just type in calc.exe, in fact there we go, and I'll choose Open. Now we can see a file hash has been created for the calc.exe program. We can also see the version number of the calc file and a little bit of information about the application. We can also see that its default security level is disallowed, and that's what we do want. We don't want anyone to run the calculator, so we'll click on OK. Now at this point we are going to run into a problem if we fire up an XP machine and get them to run the Windows calculator. So we'll do that and you'll see what I mean. Okay, here we are in a Windows XP machine. I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-Delete, and then I'm going to log our user Bob onto our domain. Then I'm going to attempt to see if we can actually run the Windows calculator. So I'm going to go and click on Start, All Programs, Accessories, Calculator. And there you go, calculator runs. So what's the deal? I know we just went and created a hash value for it, so why don't we just switch back to our Windows 2003 server and find out what went wrong. Now the problem lies here in the version number of the file. Remember, we created this hash value from the calc.exe program that was stored on our Windows 2003 server. The problem is we tried to block our user Bob from running calc.exe on Windows XP, and the file versions are different. So what we're going to have to do is go back and create a new hash value, but this time when we click on Browse, what we'll do is we'll use a UNC path to go across to our XP machine and get a hash of the XP calculator. Okay, so this time I provided a path to a file that's coming off XP client under the C$ Windows System32 directly to the calc.exe, and then we'll click on Open. And now we see our file hash and we see some information, and of course it's disallowed by default. We'll click on OK. So now we have two hash rules, both for calc.exe, but we can see that the file versions are different. Okay, so here we are back with our user Bob. I'm just going to log him off right now. And then I'll press Ctrl-Alt-Delete and I'll enter in his password one more time. We'll log him straight back onto the domain. So we'll click on Start, All Programs, Accessories, Calculator, and this time Bob can't run Calculator because it's been prevented by a software restriction policy. Now that's what we wanted to see. So the rule of the thumb here is make sure that you create the hash rule for the operating system or file version that you want the rule to apply, or it simply won't work. Okay, the next type of rule we'll look at is the path rule. So we'll right click and we'll select path rule. Now here we can enter a path to a location where we want to allow or disallow files to run. So for example, we could enter in %systemroot %/system32, and this would prevent users from running applications in the Windows System32 directory. In fact, thinking back to our calculator example, we could also use this path rule. Then regardless of which operating system we had, the Windows calculator wouldn't be able to run in either case, as the file is stored in this location. Of course, the downside to using path rules is that if the application is copied into a different location, then the file will still be able to be executed by the user. Now another thing we can use a path rule for is a wildcard type entry where we can restrict certain file types from running. So let's say for example we didn't want users to be able to run batch files. We could simply create a new path rule that specifies batch files and then disallow it. Now users simply can't run batch files. Now this brings me to the next type of rule, a certificate rule. Now we just configured a path rule so we could not run batch files, but we can use a certificate rule that lets us run batch files if we have a valid certificate. So we'd right click and select New Certificate Rule, and then we'd simply select the Browse button and then browse for any certificate files that we might have. And at this point we could then set the security level to unrestricted. Then anything that has a certificate, including batch files, will be allowed to run. Now this brings me to another point, the order in which these rules are processed. Now when an application is launched, it's compared against this list of rules. Now the first type that gets evaluated is the hash rule. If a hash rule is found and it's set to disallowed, then the application is prevented from running. Next comes the certificate rule, followed by the path rule and then the internet zone rule. So in our example of using a certificate to allow a signed batch file to run, it would first check against the hash rules, and there's no match here, so it moves on and evaluates the certificate rule. Of course it would then find a match and then allow the script to run. But other unsigned batch files would make their way all throughout the hash and certificate rules, and they'd finally hit our path rule here, which says, oh, I'm not going to let any batch files run, so they won't work. Alright, now the final type of rule we have is the internet zone rule. Like with the other rules, we could simply set our internet zone rules to either disallowed or unrestricted. So up here under our internet zone, we can choose from the internet, local computer, local intranet, restricted sites and trusted sites. So say for example, we'll choose our local intranet and we could set the default security level to unrestricted. So our users could access our intranet sites. Then we could set, say, the internet zone to disallowed, if we didn't want any of our users to access the internet. Okay, so these are the 4 types of rules that you can create. Now let's go and have a look at some of the other restrictions that we can put in place. If we click on Software Restriction Policies, we have 3 other options: Enforcement, Designated File Types, and Trusted Publishers. Now, enforcement policies allow us to decide whether our software restriction policies apply to all software files except DLLs or all files. Now, leaving the first option checked can be a wise choice in situations where applications are using shared DLLs, because if you choose to apply this to all software, then any other applications that are using those shared DLLs won't run. Now, we can also have these restrictions apply to all users or all users except local administrators. And this is probably the choice that you'll go with, because administrators often need to run additional applications to be able to do their jobs. Now next we have designated file types. And in here we can define what constitutes executable code. Now there's a rather large list of predefined types, and most of these you'll recognise. These are things like batch files and COM files and VB scripts and so on. Now you can certainly add your own in here by simply typing in the extension and then clicking on Add. Now finally we have the Trusted Publishers option. Now this is where we can specify who can select trusted publishers. So whether we're going to leave that up to end users to make the decision, or if it has to be a local or an enterprise administrator. And before trusting any publishers, we have the option of checking the publisher and the timestamp to see if the certificate has been revoked. Alright, so that's software restrictions. They can be very useful to implement in your organisation, not only to rein in new users, but also to prevent malicious applications and code from running rampant in your network.